Imagine this. The Pentagon. Just weeks after 9/11. The air still thick with smoke, with jet fuel. And Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld steps up, quotes Churchill, basically saying, in wartime, truth needs a bodyguard of lies.
Yeah, he was talking about misleading the enemy, of course. But it makes you wonder, doesn't it?
It really does. How much truth did Americans actually get about Afghanistan, their longest war?
Well, that's exactly what we're digging into today. We're using this incredible book called the Afghanistan Papers.
Right.
It's based on thousands of internal government documents, plus over 1,000 interviews with officials, people who are right there on the ground or making decisions.
So our mission, really, is to unpack what's in those pages, get to the unvarnished truth about why this war just dragged on, becoming a stalemate, and how the public story often seemed, well, very different from what officials were saying privately.
Exactly. It's about peeling back those layers.
And this whole process, getting these deep insights, it's really what we try to foster over on our YouTube channel, Mindful Moments. We use AI analysis of books there to spark reflection, rational thought. This kind of deep dive is a perfect example.
It really is. Finding those crucial pieces of understanding.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. After 9/11, the support for going into Afghanistan was, well, almost universal, wasn't it?
It really was. Totally different from Vietnam or even Iraq later.
Mm.
Congress authorized war almost immediately. NATO invoked Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all for the first time ever. Even Iran, surprisingly, expressed solidarity.
And then the military action itself seemed incredibly successful at first.
Oh, remarkably so. The U.S. and allies, they toppled the Taliban and al-Qaeda in under 6 weeks. By the time President Bush gave that victory speech, I think only 20 American casualties. It looked like a swift, decisive win.
People thought the fighting was basically done. Some units were calling it the mop-up stage.
Yeah, there are accounts like one paratrooper battalion in Kandahar expecting heavy fighting, but they ended up just playing video games because there wasn't much combat. Another rifle platoon was there 8 weeks, didn't have a single firefight, called it actually very boring.
So this quick success, it kind of fostered this idea that, okay, mission accomplished almost.
But here's where things get tricky. That initial, very clear mission to defeat al-Qaeda, stop another 9/11, it started to get fuzzy pretty fast.
How so?
Well, one U.S. official working with NATO put it bluntly. He asked, what were we actually doing in that country? The mission became blurred. Also blurred were our objectives, nation building, women's rights. That core question of why are we still here started really early.
And behind the scenes, the planning sounds almost chaotic.
Yeah, Lieutenant Commander Philip Kapusta said Pentagon orders were short on specifics. Plans were kind of made up on the fly.
And that story about Rumsfeld giving Doug Faith and General Pace just 4 hours to write a whole new strategic analysis.
It's wild, isn't it? Faith, who'd never served in uniform, writing this critical plan with generals looking over his shoulder. A job that usually takes months.
No wonder General Tommy Franks apparently called Faith the fucking stupidest guy on the face of the earth. It speaks volumes.
It does. And all this was happening while commanders were genuinely surprised by how quickly they were advancing. At Central Command, they marveled. One general apparently exclaimed, "Hey, you didn't believe this shit would work?" And everyone just nodded.
So success almost happened despite the planning, not because of it.
It kind of looks that way. Suggests maybe there wasn't a deep, coherent strategy right from the very start.
Okay, but then comes Tora Bora, December 2001. This feels like a huge turning point. Osama bin Laden was reportedly cornered there.
He was. And the CIA, the Army Delta Force commanders on the ground, they were pleading for reinforcements, asking for maybe 800 to 2,000 Army Rangers to seal the area.
But General Franks said no.
He refused. He talked about the political contest, questioned the appetite for putting maybe 15,000 or 20,000 more Americans in Afghanistan, even though that wasn't what was being asked for.
And bin Laden slipped away.
He did. Many see that decision as fundamentally prolonging the war, a critical missed opportunity.
And then, to make it worse, Franks and Rumsfeld later kind of obscured the truth, didn't they? Suggested maybe bin Laden wasn't even there.
Yes, Franks wrote an op-ed saying Mr. bin Laden was never within our grasp. It was a clear attempt to manage the narrative, to basically cover up that failure.
Chilling. And at the same time, there was a diplomatic angle that failed too.
Right. While bin Laden was trapped, some Taliban leaders were actually signaling they might be willing to surrender to negotiate at a conference in Bonn, Germany.
But the U.S. and its allies weren't interested.
No. The Bush administration, the Northern Alliance, they basically refused, labeled the Taliban terrorists who deserved death or prison, end of story. Barnett Rubin, a UN advisor, called it a major mistake. No appetite for a threat reduction, as he put it, just rigidity.
So these early stages, the quick win, the Tora Bora fumble, the missed diplomacy, they really set the stage for everything that followed, including this massive shift towards nation building.
Exactly. The book calls it the hubris of nation building. Stephen Hadley, Bush's deputy national security advisor, basically said, look, we have to do this. There's no other way to guarantee al-Qaeda won't come back, even though the initial stance was, we don't do nation building.
And the scale was just immense, wasn't it? The money involved.
Unbelievable. $143 billion between 2001 and 2020. That's more than the entire Marshall Plan for rebuilding Europe after World War II, adjusted for inflation.
Wow. But it went astray from the start.
Pretty much. At first, it was a miserly approach, not enough funding. Then later, they just flooded the place with more aid than it could possibly handle, creating all sorts of new problems. And economist Michael Callan just lamented, we spent so much money and there's so little to show for it.
And some of the specific examples in the book are just, well, absurd. Building schools next to empty schools.
Yeah, even when locals were saying, we don't really want schools. We want our kids herding goats. Or giving communities electricity they had no idea what to do with, just hoping it would somehow convince them to abandon the Taliban.
It sounds utterly disconnected from reality. Lieutenant General Douglas Lute asked, essentially, just because we can pour money down a hole, should we? Can't we be more rational?
A very fair question. It highlights a fundamental disconnect between the goals and the methods. A real misunderstanding of the local context.
And a huge part of this nation building was creating an Afghan army and police force, right?
That was central. The plan was for a 70,000-strong army, 62,000 police officers. But even there, problems started early. Rumsfeld initially capped the army size at 50,000, going against recommendations for a much larger force.
And the training itself sounds like it was deeply flawed.
Or deeply. You had trainers arriving with no idea what to do. One major saying you basically couldn't fail basic training. Another seeing only 10% of recruits pass marksmanship, but they all graduated anyway.
It sounds almost comical if it weren't so serious. A major having to write names on weapons so soldiers wouldn't lose them.
Yes, and stories about cultural misunderstandings, like mistaking urinals for drinking fountains or refusing coats until it was actually freezing. Just fundamental gaps.
And maybe the biggest issue was motivation. Why were Afghans joining?
Well, one major, Charles Abeo Ordina, found most low-ranking soldiers told him flat out they'd leave as soon as the U.S. did. They planned to go back and grow opium or marijuana or something like that, because that's where the money is.
So it wasn't about building loyalty to a nation. It was just a job for now.
For many, it seems that way. A transactional relationship, which really undermines the whole idea of building a sustainable national force.
And this ties into the broader cultural chasm you mentioned. The book says very few U.S. personnel spoke Dari or Pashto. One major read Islam for Dummies on the plane over.
Yes, it shows the lack of deep preparation. Troops trained for swamps ended up in mountains. Arabic was sometimes taught instead of the local languages. Even simple gestures, like a thumbs up, caused offense.
It sounds like operating in a completely alien environment. One major said for 95% of the Afghans he met, we might as well have been aliens.
That sums it up pretty well. Another major used a Star Wars analogy. American troops kitted out for war looked like stormtroopers. Not exactly the best image for winning hearts and minds, as he pointed out.
And building trust must have been incredibly difficult. That anecdote about the Afghan man calling a baby-faced American soldier his wife.
Yeah, tense, awkward, revealing the huge cultural gulfs that make genuine connection and trust building so incredibly hard.
Adding another layer of complexity was Pakistan, a supposed ally, but the book says they bedeviled the Americans for 2 decades.
Absolutely, playing a double game. You had insurgents slipping across the border from Pakistan, attacking U.S. forces from places like Firebase Shkin. Sometimes Pakistani forces even fired rockets at Americans.
While taking billions in U.S. aid.
Exactly. Around $10 billion. They'd capture some al-Qaeda figures for bounty money, but simultaneously, U.S. officials knew Pakistan was hedging its bets. And Advisor Rumsfeld saw this failure to perceive the double game way back in late 2002.
And a Pakistani official basically admitted it to Ambassador Ryan Crocker, didn't he?
He did. Said something like, you think we're hedging our bets. You're right, because one day you'll be gone again. It shows how Pakistan was playing the long game, undermining U.S. efforts the whole time.
So amidst all this, the failing nation building, the cultural gaps, the double-dealing ally, the public was still being told things were progressing.
Consistently. That's one of the core themes. In 2005, Rumsfeld was claiming things were going so well, troops would soon come home. But just months later, in early 2006, the U.S. Ambassador Ronald Newman sent a secret cable warning violence was likely to rise.
This gap between public optimism and private reality seems constant.
It was. There was immense pressure to show progress, to generate positive metrics. John Garofano mentioned an expensive machine just to print huge charts showing success, but admitted, these are not actually scientific figures.
Just manipulated data.
An unnamed National Security Council staffer was blunt. The metrics were always manipulated for the duration of the war. It created a completely false picture, maybe even fooling policymakers themselves sometimes.
And the definition of winning kept shifting, right? Senator Collins asked Obama how he'd know if the surge worked, and one major said, you can spin numbers any way you want.
Yeah, but James Dobbins, a veteran diplomat, offered a chillingly simple metric. Afghan casualties. If the number's going up, you're losing. If the number's going down, you're winning.
A metric rarely discussed publicly.
Precisely. And then you have the symbolic end-of-combat mission ceremony in 2014. Obama wasn't even there, issued remarks from Hawaii. But the book stresses the war was nowhere near a conclusion.
By then, public support had plummeted too, from 90% down to only 38% thinking the war was worth it.
The public was catching on, sensing the disconnect.
So this leads us into the deeper quagmire. Corruption seems absolutely central to why things unraveled so badly.
It truly was a cancer, as Hillary Clinton put it. Hamid Karzai's fraudulent re-election in 2009 just made a bad situation worse, unleashing a deluge of corruption.
And the shocking part is how the U.S. actually fueled it.
Unintentionally, yes. Barnett Rubin nailed it. The basic assumption was that corruption is an Afghan problem, and we are the solution. But there is one indispensable ingredient for corruption money, and we were the ones who had the money.
So the aid itself became the fuel.
To a large extent. One forensic accountant estimated maybe 18% of Defense Department contract money, billions, ended up going to the Taliban and insurgents. Another 15% skimmed by corrupt officials. U.S. money was inadvertently propping up the enemy and enriching crooks.
That's staggering. And the Kabul bank scandal in 2010.
A perfect example. Insiders basically loaned themselves hundreds of millions, nearly collapsing the financial system, and the U.S. had advisors in the bank who missed it entirely.
And even when it came out, Karzai resisted anti-corruption efforts.
He did. He resented U.S. pressure, and meaningful reform just stalled. It showed how deeply entrenched the problem was and how difficult it was for the U.S. to effectively combat it.
This corruption must have totally eroded trust, contributing to things like the insider attacks, the green-on-blue killings.
Absolutely. Those attacks surged dramatically, from just 2 in 2008 up to 45 in 2012, killing 116 U.S. and NATO personnel. Marine General John Allen was furious, saying, we're willing to sacrifice, but not to be murdered by our supposed allies.
A terrifying indicator of breakdown, and yet publicly these were often called isolated incidents.
Yes, downplayed consistently, even though internal military studies were warning of a growing systemic threat. It's more evidence of that persistent gap between reality and the official narrative.
Just reinforcing the self-deception, one former State Department official called the whole idea of building that Afghan military so fast insane.
Yet the public statements often remained optimistic. Lieutenant General Mark Milley, later chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was boasting in 2013 that the conditions are set for winning this war, even as the Taliban was clearly regaining ground.
It led to moments like Senator Elizabeth Warren telling General Miller in 2018, "We've supposedly turned the corner so many times that it seems now we're going in circles."
A perfect summary of the frustrating cycle of claimed progress and actual stalemate or regression.
And the human cost, especially for Afghans, was immense.
Devastating. Over 64,000 Afghan soldiers and police killed by late 2019. That's 18 times the number of U.S. and NATO deaths combined. A staggering sacrifice, often overlooked in Western reporting.
All while the core strategic confusion remained. Even in 2009, a major was saying there wasn't a clear strategy.
Right. Another major, Joseph Claiborne, summed it up perfectly. If you asked him what leaving looked like, what conditions needed to be met, he said basically we could be here an extremely long time because nobody can define it.
This lack of a clear what does winning look like, or even what does leaving look like, seems fundamental.
It absolutely was. Which brings us to President Biden's reflection in 2021 as he prepared to withdraw. He asked, what's the rationale for staying? What conditions must be met to leave, and concluded, I'm not hearing any good answers, and if you can't answer them, we should not stay.
A sobering end to 2 decades of conflict based on insights very similar to what this book reveals.
Exactly. What the Afghanistan Papers lays bare is this consistent pattern. Public statements masking a grim reality. Systemic failures like corruption and cultural blindness, huge costs in lives and treasure, and a fundamental, persistent lack of clear strategy or achievable goals.
It really shows how misjudgment and, frankly, deception, even if perhaps initially well-intentioned by some, can lead to catastrophe.
Precisely. And trying to understand these complex truths, getting past the simple narratives, that's really essential. It's why we value tools like the AI book analysis we feature on our YouTube channel, Mindful Moments. It helps cut through the noise.
Absolutely. You can find Mindful Moments on YouTube. And of course, all of our podcasts are available wherever you usually listen.
We really hope you'll subscribe to this deep dive if you haven't already, and maybe share it with someone else who likes to dig into complex topics.
And if you want to read the source material yourself, we've put a link in the show notes where you can purchase the Afghanistan Papers. It supports crucial investigative journalism.
Definitely worth reading.
So, as we close, here's something to think about. Given everything we've discussed, the rosy public picture versus the bleak private one, the self-deception, the inability to even define winning, what questions should we always ask when our leaders talk about major global challenges or military interventions?
Yeah, how do we, as citizens trying to stay informed, make sure we're looking past that bodyguard of lies Rumsfeld mentioned and demanding the actual truth?
A crucial question for all of us.